The Victoria Cross is the highest award that can be provided to any Australian serviceman or woman for their valour. It is a very serious award. And as Prime Minister and as a government, we have a very special responsibility to ensure that the integrity of the Victoria Cross is upheld for all of those who have been honoured by having bestowed upon them that award, and all the others that will. And so it is not done lightly that a recommendation would be made for a Victoria Cross contemporaneously, which of the 100 VCs that have been awarded to Australians, that has been the case in all of those circumstances. The service, the actions undertaken by that individual has been the subject of recommendations that have come from those who were there at the time and those commanders who made the relevant recommendations, and this was done contemporaneously. Our system, though, does provide, in exceptional circumstances, where there has been instances of maladministration or where new evidence has been brought forward, for higher awards to be considered in those circumstances. And it has certainly been the case in relation to Ordinary Seaman Teddy Sheean that this has been a case that issues have arisen now over some time. And it is also the case that this case has been the subject of a series of reviews and panels. And the challenge that the government was faced with was that we had two findings of equal standing from two reviews, neither related to each other, that had concluded different results. And so the government was presented with conflicting evidence. Now, you don't go around handing out VCs on the basis of popularity or sentiment. Certainly in cases that involve events of many, many years ago, and in this case the 1st of December 1942. We must be careful to guard against arrogance, that we today can stand in the shoes of those of all those years ago and pretend to know that we know those events better than those who were dealing with acts of bravery that today's generation, except for those who've served, could not imagine. That said, the opportunity we have is the process we have to uphold the integrity and ensure that justice is done to these incredibly brave actions. So, when presented with the findings of the tribunal review, we had to address this matter of conflict between that review and the comprehensive one done in 2013 that had come to a different conclusion. And the responsibility of making a recommendation to Her Majesty, in order for that to be successful, would need to be able to demonstrate the highest bar being set for such a recognition in the case of Ordinary Seaman Teddy Sheean. And so I asked Dr. Nelson, given his extensive experience, not just most recently as the most outstanding head of the War Memorial that we've seen since its founder, but also because of his role as a former Defence Minister, a long-standing member of Cabinet, to draw together an expert panel comprising Mr Bennett, who, as a former Solicitor General of the Commonwealth, together with the former head of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, Dr Shergold, and Brad Manera, an outstanding historian from New South Wales, military historian. I tasked them to tell us, to reconcile the conflicts in these two positions that had come forward, and in particular to determine the issue of whether new evidence had been established that would enable a recommendation to be made to that end. And I received that report at the end of July, and the report found as follows: that there is compelling new evidence in support of higher recognition for Sheean, that Sheean was done a substantial injustice in consideration of his actions in the original decision-making period in 1942 to 1943, and Sheean's courageous sacrifice of his life to save his shipmates makes him eligible for the Victoria Cross for Australia, and the highest level of recognition should be accorded in this exceptional case. I have accepted these findings, and I have so written to the Governor-General on the basis of the recommendation received to me from the Minister Defence on the basis of this review. And these matters are now before Her Majesty, and we would be hopeful of what would come back as a contented response from Her Majesty. It is incredibly important we hold this to the highest bar. I am very pleased that the process that we've followed removes any doubt, certainly in my mind, and any doubt, I believe, in terms of our knowledge of these events and what should be done. Any ambiguity that existed before, if that had been allowed to prevail by acting hastily, that could have undermined the recommendation that we had made. So I can now make this recommendation confidently on the basis of the process that we've followed. I want to thank two people in particular, apart from, of course, Dr. Nelson and the members of his expert panel. I want to thank Gavin Pearce, who, as the member for Braddon and also an ex-serviceman, provided important advice about getting the balance right of protecting the integrity of the VC, but also to ensure that these issues were dealt with by a proper process, and that there could be no doubt either on any potential recommendation of an award of the VC for Teddy Sheean, or indeed anyone else who had been awarded with the VC. He provided important advice, as particularly an ex-serviceman. I also want to thank the many others who have been involved in this important process over a long period of time. I want to thank the family of Teddy Sheean for their patience and their forbearance, and I'm sure they'll be very pleased about this result today. I also want to thank a good friend and a former colleague here in the Federal Parliament, Guy Barnett, for the way that he engaged with this process. Guy has never pursued this issue as a matter of popular sentiment. He has pursued it as a matter of justice, and I want to thank him for the way he engaged with me to ensure that we could properly address the outstanding issues that needed to be addressed in order to make this recommendation possible. But I'm very thankful to Dr. Nelson and his full panel, and I'd ask him to make some comments on these matters.
Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister. It has been a privilege to oversee the examination of the Teddy Sheean issue, and I certainly came to it with an open mind, but with a disposition not to support retrospective awards, particularly a Victoria Cross. As the Prime Minister said, awarding a Victoria Cross 8 decades after the events is something that should not be entered into lightly, and only when the evidence is compelling and the case for doing so is exceptional. And that is precisely the case here. This young man, this young Tasmanian, Ordinary Seaman Edward, or Teddy Sheean, was the youngest, lowest ranked sailor on HMAS Armidale. The ship was attacked just after 3 p.m. on the 1st of December 1942. The report of proceedings from the commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander David Richards, was written only the day after he arrived in Darwin, 6 days after the sinking of the ship. And in relation to Sheean, he said that Ordinary Seaman Teddy Edward Sheean remained at his post at the aft oilercan and, through his actions, downed one enemy bomber and remained at his gun until he was killed. The Board of Inquiry was held the following day, and then the report of proceedings, which included that reference to Sheean, went forward to the Australian Commonwealth Naval Board and subsequently on to the Lords of Admiralty. It is an uncontested fact that Commander David Richards' report was both incomplete and inaccurate in relation to the description of Sheean's actions. It's also the case the Australian station of the Australian Commonwealth Naval Board did not use the Royal Navy Form 57 used everywhere else in the world, as was its practice, nor did it use the Australian equivalent Form 58. It also did not fully comply with its own instructions in CNO Order 43/42 to precisely in detail explain whatever action was being awarded. In 1945, one of the survivors, Russell Caro, wrote a lengthy report about what had happened during the sinking, which accords largely with the facts as they are known today. The evidence emerged in the decades following the end of the war. The 2013 inquiry, to which the Prime Minister refers, of unresolved recognition of naval and military acts of courage and valour from the past, examined in detail all 14 cases referred to it, including the Sheean case. But in the case of looking at these, examined these cases under a different part of the Defence Act, where it was required to be mindful of government policy not to retrospectively award such awards, and also to uphold the integrity of both the Australian and the Imperial Honours system. Its very comprehensive collection of evidence, however, was, in our opinion, flawed in its analysis. And then in 2019, under a different section of the Act, considering an appeal by a Veterans Minister from Tasmania, Guy Barnett, against the decision of the Department of Defence not to award the Victoria Cross to Sheean, it then examined all of the evidence available, had two pieces of new evidence, and including from the Chief of Navy, and recommended the Victoria Cross be given. I can also advise you that the expert panel has found new evidence, and that is, for the first time, we actually went and had a look at the Japanese aviation military records in the National Institute for Defence Studies in Tokyo, and we are very thankful to the Australian War Memorial and Dr. Steve Bullard for the assistance he gave us in this regard. And what the Japanese records show, in meticulous detail, is that the ship was attacked at the precise location, the precise time, by 7 so-called Betty bombers, Japanese bombers, and 3 Japanese Zeros. The Japanese records accord with the Royal Australian Navy official history in terms of the torpedo and then the bomb landing on the ship. It records 6 minutes from the first attack to the sinking of the ship, which gave Sheean to do what he did. And also, further to that as the ship sank, the aircraft took enemy fire from the ship and 2 aircraft were damaged. It's also the case that the Japanese Zeros expended 15% of their machine gun ammunition in the only contact they had that day, which was against Armidale, consistent with the strafing of men in the water. The uncontested facts are that ordinary seaman Teddy Sheean, when the ship was listing 50 degrees to the port side, obeyed the order to abandon ship. He went to the port side of the doomed and listing ship, and then alongside able seaman Ted Pellet, who was chopping the ropes from the motorboat. Pellet got into the boat, but Sheean was seen to move as if to get into the boat, and then instead of doing so turned, unwounded, and made his way up to the back of the ship with the stern rising. He was wounded on the way to the gun. He was not the gunner at the aft oilerkin, he was the loader. But he strapped himself into that gun, into the harness, and then he began firing at the attacking Japanese aircraft that was strafing his shipmates and killing them in the water. He was wounded again while firing the gun, and then was killed at the gun. Whether he was killed as a consequence of wounds or drowned attached to the gun as the ship sank remains unclear. So in summary, this man deserves the Victoria Cross for Australia. The decision is made on the basis of maladministration, by omission, and also by testing his conspicuous gallantry and preeminent valour against the eligibility criteria in the letters patent for the Victoria Cross and the regulations. And I would say to all Australians, as we live through the most significant adversity in our lifetimes, approaching the 75th anniversary of the Second World War, let Teddy Sheean inspire us to be a people that are selfless, caring and brave. And I thank the Prime Minister for having the foresight to put together a group of people that were able to consider all of the evidence that is available and give us the opportunity to find more. Thank you.
Thank you. Take some questions on this matter. Yeah.
Now that this issue been resolved, would it be a good idea to try and resolve the issue too about John Monash? Whether he should get a field marshal, maybe have a look at that in a similar process?
Well, look, there are many other cases that have come before us. This one was very pressing, given the more recent review that I received from the tribunal. I think the circumstances around these two things are very different. That is about a commissioning, not a valor award, and they're two very different exercises. So I'm not proposing to go any further on that matter. But on this issue, Teddy Sheean's valor has never been in question. I want to stress that. It's never been in question. What has been important is to ensure that the process has been of the highest standard and there can be no ambiguity about it. So a fulsome recommendation can be confidently made, and that is now the case. It wasn't the case for me some time ago. It is now that case.
Well, Minister, is this something which is supported by all military top brass? And is it somewhat embarrassing that we've had to wait 80 years for this?
This is an exceptional case. And it took many years for this case to first emerge after the Second World War in terms of whether the award that was provided was sufficient for the gallantry on that day. And sometimes justice takes a long time, but I'm pleased that it is now being addressed. And I have had no recommendation from Defence that is inconsistent now with the recommendations I have from the panel. I welcome that, and I thank the Minister for Defence for her recommendation.
I'd like Dr. Nelson to answer as well. Hek Matula.
Well, I've invited Dr. Nelson to be here today on the basis of his role on this expert panel. I'm happy to deal with matters of defence, which I'll come to, and I'm aware of the matter you want to raise, and I'll be happy to address that. Thank you.
Do you expect this case to create a flood of new cases with revisions of other military awards?
Well, I'll ask Dr. Nelson to speak to this as well. I think that's unlikely. I mean, the Sheean case was quite exceptional, and it does stand out from the many others that have been considered in the past. And I think that's why it's been able to get past what has been a very high threshold that we've established. And so that may be the case. I think it's unlikely to be the case in any significant number. But if it were to be the case, then it would be pursued in the same way, and it would have to meet the very high standard that I've insisted upon. But Brendan?
Prime Minister, yes, those cases that are likely to be brought forward have already been brought forward, in my opinion, and been considered. Mark Sullivan, who's the incumbent chair of the Defence Honours and Awards Tribunal, said to me in the inquiry, he said, I personally have been involved in consideration of 11 applications for retrospective Victoria Crosses. He said, I have not supported any of them except this one. My view also is, as a person whose natural disposition, as I said, is not to support retrospectivity, is that if there are other cases like Sheean, to which we are currently not yet introduced, then if injustices have been done, then let us consider them. Personally, I think it is most unlikely that there will be any case like Sheean that will come forward. And I should have said, it's in our report, but I should have said, Lieutenant Commander David Richards, his ship is sunk on the 1st of December 1942. The day after he gets back to Darwin, having been at sea with 22 survivors for 6 days, he writes his report. Not all of the survivors or witnesses have even returned to Darwin, and those that did were told not to speak about anything in relation to the sinking. He described Sheean as having remained at his post. His post was not the gunner, he was the loader. And then he went on to describe him shooting down one plane. We now know that Sheean actually damaged 2 planes, but survivors in the water could be forgiven with their short horizon for thinking that a plane trailing smoke had gone down into the water. Importantly, Lieutenant Commander Richards did not describe Sheean as having left the gun, gone to the side of the ship, and then looking into a boat into which, if he'd got, he'd almost certainly have survived and certainly had a much greater chance. Instead of that, he turns away from the opportunity to save his life, to literally give his life up to do what he could to save men in the water by going back to the gun and shooting it. So this is an injustice has been done to Sheean by a series of missteps, missed opportunities, and at times some mistakes that have been made in examination of the facts in relation to his actions. He, as the Prime Minister said, he's a man of whom we've always been proud. But now, if you like, we put him amongst those other 100 Victoria Cross recipients as literally the bravest of the brave.